As David approached his rocket, agents and officials talked quietly amongst themselves, and then asked David if he would accompany them back to the base. They explained that they had another spacecraft that they'd like him to have a look at. David was unaware that he was, in fact, at the Area 51 Groom Lake facility with all of its alien connections. David agreed, and they travelled back to base and entered a huge hangar about 4 football fields in size. Following the officers, David walked to the centre of the floor. Suddenly, railings and chains rose out of the ground, topped with small red and yellow flashing lights. David heard a loud mechanical sound, and then a large area of the floor where they stood started to descend. Clearly they were on some sort of large elevator that was taking them underground. David recalls going down about 20 levels. The elevator stopped, and David could see a number of workshops. The environment was bright and sterile. David was escorted down a corridor to another large room, where the ceiling was fitted with many diffused lights. He described this room as
similar to a vehicle spraying area, where you cannot see any shadows.
David was shown to an area of the laboratory where something large stood, covered in a white sheet. It looked about the size of a school bus. A lab technician approached and pulled back the covers and revealed what looked to be some sort of engine. David was intrigued. He had never seen an engine like this one before. It was smooth, no rivets or seams, and had clearly been damaged. There was a section in the centre that looked as if it had been hit by an explosion, revealing a hole about 4 feet in diameter. One of the officials stepped forward and asked David if he knew how it functioned. David approached the engine and climbed on top of it. He was fascinated. The engine had a sheen, creating a rainbow prism of light across it, rather like when you angle the play surface of a DVD to a light source. Strangely, when he ran his hands over the alloy, light radiated across the surface. It wasn't a change in light that the engine was picking up on. It was reacting to being touched by his hand. Some areas of the engine were almost translucent, like a sheet of amber. David then placed his full palm onto the engine's surface and watched as the light swirled and radiated farther the harder he pressed his hand onto it. There was no visible wiring or firing mechanism. The surface was smooth and slick-looking, with no corners and everything rounded off, just like an injection mould. It was cold to the touch, but within seconds would heat up to match the temperature of his hand. David didn't know of any alloy that could do that. Well, not as quickly. David walked around on top of the engine until he came to the hole that had been blown out, and clambered into it to get a better look. He noticed that the inner walls were just as smooth as the outside. However, where the blast had occurred were smooth edges, more like torn flesh than damaged metal. David climbed back out of the hole. He had finally figured out what this thing was. He turned to the officials and said,
"This isn't from around here, is it?"
The official didn't reply.
"I'm assuming by the size of this engine it came out of a craft, a very big one by the proportional size, probably 300 feet across. Is it alien?"
Unfortunately, that was exactly the wrong thing to say. The military security personnel rushed up and grabbed him.
"Time to leave. You've seen enough."
As he was being forced down and off the engine, he placed his hands back on its surface, and something rather strange happened. Instead of seeing a smooth spiralling around his hands, it now appeared as small tornadoes bursting from his fingers. The engine was reacting to his emotions. Was this thing symbiotic in some way? David looked closely at the shell of the engine and saw slowly moving subsurface patterns resembling brainwaves. David surmised that when a pilot operates the craft that this engine came off, it was controlled by their thought waves. As he'd seen, when he first touched the engine in a relaxed and curious mood, there was a smooth spiral radiating around his hand. But when he was being forced off the engine, he was angry. and tight small spirals exuded from his fingertips. David figured out that this engine would utilize brain waves and be capable of a symbiotic relationship with the pilot. There was no wiring, circuitry and firing system because the pilot's brain was the circuitry and firing system, and the engine responded to these biosignals in order to do all of its functions. David was quickly ushered out of the facility. Clearly no one wanted to answer his questions. He was taken back up on the elevator to the waiting officers.
Never mind about that, we were just curious. Now about your rocket, David. Remarkable technology, remarkable.
It became obvious to David that they wanted to keep his rocket, and that they had a legal right to do so because it had been built with money from federal grants. But he didn't trust them not to use it for nefarious purposes.
Oh, well, perhaps you'd better keep it then,
he said, pretending to be compliant.
But would it be okay for me to give it a final inspection, please?
This was David's opportunity to sabotage his own engine. Before they could stop him, he yanked a few wires and switched on the particle accelerators. Rushing back to the vehicle, he shouted,
"It's unstable, it's going to blow,"
and jumped in as it sped away from the rocket. Sure enough, the rocket exploded violently and blew a hole out of the ground about the size of a football field. The officers were furious and told him that he was going nowhere for the rest of his life. Eventually, General Curtis LeMay managed to get him released. And as he was being flown back home, he wondered where the mothercraft was hidden and from where it had come. Obviously, due to his advanced knowledge of engine propulsion, the powers that be had wanted to see if he could come up with answers about that secret symbiotic engine that they had tucked away at Area 51. In more recent times, McDonnell Douglas has been toying with the idea of semi-symbiotic firing systems on the F-22 fighters. The pilot would strap on the special helmet, and all the gun mounts would mimic the head movements. However, the program was dropped, not due to bad technology, but because humans, as they discovered, are often not fully in control of themselves. Imagine this. A pilot suffers a close bereavement and, totally distressed, now has to climb into a fighter plane with live weapons. The system is totally reliant on the pilot maintaining full self-control, without distraction at all times. It's a recipe for disaster. However, such studies into symbiotic relationships with control systems do continue. In 2005, it was announced that an array of rat brain cells had successfully flown an F-22 fighter jet in a simulation. And more recently, in 2018, a team of Swiss computer scientists constructed the world's first biocomputer from cells arranged on a 3D printed scaffold that can respond to incoming data and can process it using the usual and, not, or, and nor logic gates. The cells actually grew their own connections, like neurons, showing that not only were they computing, but they were also learning. And with it, the scientists could control equipment and machinery, including, if they wished, airplanes, drones, and missiles.